Sergeant Dufresne dropped the target sheet on the table in front of the entire range assessment panel and said, loud enough that the two observers near the back wall could hear it clearly, she missed. Corporal Kehoe, standing 3 positions to her left, said nothing. She had been on this base for 11 hours. She picked up the sheet, looked at it once, set it back down, and said 2 words so quietly the panel had to lean forward to catch them. Wrong target. The range went so silent in the particular way that rooms go silent when something has happened that no one was prepared for. Kehoe had driven through the gate at Canadian Forces Base Petawawa in a civilian pickup with Ontario plates and a canvas bag in the back that contained everything she had brought with her. The duty sergeant at the gate had checked her credentials twice, studied her face the way people study faces when they're trying to place something they almost recognize, and waved her through without further comment. She parked, stepped out, and stood in the gray November morning for a moment before moving. The air smelled like frozen ground and propellant. She had known that smell since she was 19. She found the range administration building without asking for directions. Inside, a young private named Thibodeau looked up from behind the intake desk with the expression of someone who had been told to expect a transferring instructor but had formed a specific picture in his mind and was now quietly revising it. She was 31 years old, 5'6", and carried herself with the compressed stillness of a person accustomed to waiting for long periods in uncomfortable conditions. She wore no rank insignia on her jacket. She had not been told to. "Corporal Kehoe," Thibodeau said. "That's me." He straightened slightly. "Major Griffith asked me to get you your temporary access card and briefing packet." He slid a manila envelope across the counter. He also said the range assessment panel meets at 07:30 tomorrow, and that you've been assigned to observe the CSOR qualification trials for the duration of your attachment. "Observe," she said. Thibodeau hesitated the way people hesitate when the word they've just repeated carries more weight than the one before it. "Yes, Corporal. Observe and evaluate. For Project Meridian." She took the envelope without opening it. "Where's the long-range range?" Thibodeau pointed north and told her it was 700 meters past the main complex. She thanked him and walked out. She had been involved with Project Meridian for 14 months. It was a Canadian Special Operations Forces Command initiative, still classified above the pay grade of most people on this base, designed to evaluate and formalize precision marksmanship doctrine for small unit direct action tasks, specifically the integration of real-time environmental computation and unconventional shooting positions that had emerged from observational data gathered in theater over the past decade. On paper, it was a training modernization program. In practice, based on what Kehoe had already read in the 3 briefing files she'd been given access to before arriving, someone had been running the qualification trials using methodology that was 20 years out of date and producing results that would get people killed at distance. She had seen it before. It made her jaw tight in a specific way she had learned to recognize in herself as a signal to slow down and look carefully before doing anything at all. The range assessment panel the following morning was run by Warrant Officer Dufresne. He was a broad man in his mid-40s with the unhurried authority of someone who had occupied a specific corner of institutional space for long enough that the institution had simply grown around him. He had been running precision qualification trials at Petawawa for 6 years. He knew every board measurement, every environmental variable on every range, and exactly how the qualification targets were supposed to be scored. He did not know Kehoe. He had not been told much about her, which she understood from the particular way he looked at her when she arrived. Not with hostility, not quite. With the measuring stillness of a man who has been given a piece of furniture he didn't order and is deciding where to put it. The panel that morning included Dufresne, 2 range safety officers named Pellerin and Asselin, a CSOR observer whose name tape read Vachon, and a junior training coordinator who went by the last name Bastien, and who watched everything with the careful eyes of someone deciding which direction the wind was blowing before committing to any position. Kehoe was introduced as a marksmanship consultant attached to Project Meridian. The word consultant did several things in that room, none of them entirely positive. The qualification trial began at 0800. 4 candidates went through the standard long-range precision sequence, 5 positions, varying distances from 400 to 800 meters. Wind conditions that were mild but present, targets scored on a pass-fail threshold that had been unchanged since Kehoe was in basic training. She watched from the observation line without speaking. She was building a picture, the way she always built pictures, not from the scores as they came in, but from the decision-making she could observe in each shooter's process. The position selection, the adjustments between shots, the particular moment when a shooter committed to a dope that didn't match the conditions because the conditions had shifted and the shooter was still running old information. The 4th candidate, a corporal named Gagnon, shot 2 points below threshold on his 6th position. Dufresne scored it a fail, standard procedure. Kehoe had been watching Gagnon and had noted the wind shift 4 minutes before the shot sequence began, a 12-degree change in direction that none of the range staff had flagged because the flag poles on ranges 3 and 4 were not visible from the main observation point and no one had a spotter on the lateral markers. Gagnon hadn't missed because he lacked skill. Gagnon had missed because he was shooting with data that was no longer true. She didn't say anything. She made a note in her field book with the time and the wind vector calculations she'd run in her head and kept watching. After the morning session, Dufresne came to stand beside her during the break. He wasn't unfriendly. He was assessing. He looked at her field book and didn't ask to see it, which she noticed and filed. "What did you think of Gagnon?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "He had good fundamentals," she said. "Solid position, clean trigger management. He was working off stale data on that last position. His dope was set for the wind at entry, not at target." Dufresne looked at her with the expression of a man who has been told something he already suspects is true, but hasn't decided yet whether the person telling him is in a position to say it. "Gagnon had 3 minutes to recheck conditions before he shot," he said. "That's in the protocol." She nodded. The lateral markers weren't visible from his shooting position. He was reading conditions from range 2. The shift had already moved past him by the time he looked. She paused. "Your flag coverage has a gap from 3 to 500 on the north lane." Dufresne was quiet for a moment. He looked toward the north lane. The flags were where they'd always been. He turned back to her. "You've been here 11 hours, he said. She'd been noting the flags since she arrived. "I know," she said. He walked away without responding. She did not take that as a good sign, but she didn't take it as a bad one either. She had been in rooms like this before. The work always mattered more than the welcome. Major Griffith was the commanding officer of the Petawawa Range Complex and Meridian's primary liaison. He was a careful, deliberate man in his early 50s who had the reputation in the CSOR community of being someone who thought before he spoke, always, and sometimes for a while. He had read Kehoe's file, not all of it. Portions were classified above his access level, which he had noted and not mentioned. What he'd read had been enough. He called her into his office the second evening after the range session. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He looked at her for a moment. "Dufresne flagged your comment about the wind coverage." He said the gap in flag placement isn't a gap. It's an intentional design to test candidate wind reading under degraded visual conditions. She nodded slowly. "Has that test condition been documented in the qualification parameters and shared with candidates before the trial?" A pause. "I don't know," he said. "Because if it hasn't," she said, and I say this with full respect for what Warrant Dufresne has built here, it's not a test, it's a trap. And the difference matters when you're trying to assess whether someone can perform in the field. She paused. A candidate who fails because of an undisclosed environmental variable they had no framework to solve isn't demonstrating a skills deficit. They're demonstrating that our test design has a blind spot. Griffith looked at the surface of his desk for a moment. Then he looked at her. "What's your recommendation?" She said it clearly and without hesitation. "Document the test condition, brief candidates that environmental degradation is a variable in the assessment, and score their adaptive response to it, not just the outcome. You'll get more information about who can actually perform under real conditions, and you'll stop failing people for solving a problem you gave them without the tools to solve it." Griffith was quiet for a long time, long enough that she was aware of the specific weight of silence in a CO's office and what it usually meant. Then he said, "And where does Meridian come in?" She opened the briefing folder she'd brought in with her and laid 3 pages on his desk. Meridian's core methodology. He read. She waited. Dufresne's found out about the meeting from Vachon, who had heard about it from Bastien, who had seen Kehoe walking into the CO's office with a folder. This was how information moved in tight institutional spaces, not through official channels, but through the network of people who talked to other people who watched which doors opened and what walked through them. Dufresne was not by nature a vindictive man. He was a man who had built something over 6 years, and who understood, with the clear-eyed conviction of the deeply experienced, that what he had built was right. He had run more than 300 qualification trials. He had produced some of the finest precision marksmen in the Canadian forces. He had done this his way, with his methodology, on his range, and the results were in the record. He did not need a Meridian consultant from some program he'd never heard of, attached to a file he couldn't read, to walk onto his range after 11 hours and start explaining his flag placement to him. He began doing what experienced people in institutions do when they want to make something difficult for someone without making it look like they're making it difficult. He assigned Kehoe to the administrative documentation rotation, which meant 3 hours each morning processing trial score sheets that should have been handled by Bastien. He scheduled the most interesting qualification sessions during her document review window. He referenced decisions in technical briefings as if she had already been included in conversations she had never been told about. She heard him once, in the equipment room while she was running maintenance inventory on the spotting scope brackets. His voice carried through the partition. "She's a desk analyst," he was saying. "Probably hasn't been downrange in 2 years. Meridian's a think tank program. They send people like her to places like this to write reports that nobody reads." There was a short laugh from someone. She didn't recognize the voice. Then quiet. Then Pellerin, whose voice she had placed by now. "They say her file's half classified above Griffith's level. There's something in there he can't even read." Dufresne's response, "That's not a credential. That's a clearance. Different thing entirely." She set down the bracket she was holding, picked it up again, and kept working. She had been in rooms where people said things like this about her. The specifics changed. The structure was always the same. She had learned by now that the version of her that existed in those conversations was a useful piece of fiction that people needed in order to feel like they understood the room. She did not spend energy correcting it. She spent energy on the work. That evening, she took a spotting scope and her field book to range 3 at last light. When the trails were empty, and spent 90 minutes mapping every flag, every terrain feature, every wind shadow created by the tree line on the north side, every corridor of clean flow, every dead zone where readings would lag behind actual conditions. She built a picture of that range in low-level detail that no document in the system contained. She had done this on every range she had ever worked. It was not a dramatic thing. It was just the necessary thing. The session she remembered most clearly from that first week was the one involving Private Arsenault. He was 23, the youngest candidate in the qualification cohort. A farm kid from the eastern townships who moved through the range with the careful precision of someone who had grown up around rifles and respected what they could do. He was technically proficient, his fundamentals sound, his preparation thorough. He failed his 400-meter position on the second trial day, missed by a fraction that had nothing to do with his mechanics and everything to do with a mirage layer along the ground line that read as no wind when there was, in fact, a consistent 6-knot push at target elevation. Kehoe saw it from the observation line. Arsenault didn't have the reference points to see it from his position. No one had told him to look for it. It was the kind of thing you learned from being shown, not from reading about it. Dufresne scored the miss. Standard procedure. After the session, she walked toward the main building and took the route past the prep area where candidates cleaned their equipment. Arsenault was sitting on a bench by himself, working a cleaning rod through his barrel with the methodical efficiency of muscle memory, while his face did something careful and controlled that she recognized as a man trying not to show how much a single failed position had cost him. She sat down on the far end of the bench, not close, just present, Mirage layer, she said. At that distance on a clear, cold morning, the ground temperature differential was building a bent light corridor about 18 inches off the deck. From your position, you were reading the flag at 150, which was sitting in flat air. Your bullet was traveling through something different for the last 140 meters. Arsenault looked up. He held her gaze for a moment. You could see that? From the observation line, she said, the shimmer was visible in the spotting glass. It takes a while to know what you're looking at. How do you account for it? She told him. Not a lecture. Just the specifics. How to read the indicator, what the effective wind correction looked like at different distances, how the layering changed with temperature and time of day. He listened with the focused attention of someone who understood they were being given something real. When she finished, he nodded once slowly. Dufresne's going to fail me for that position, he said. Yes, she said. There was a silence. He looked at his rifle. Then is the test designed to catch this? The test is designed to assess field capability, she said. Whether it's currently testing what it's trying to test is a different question. Arsenault looked at her with the careful eyes of someone deciding how much to say. What happens if you tell them? She thought about Griffith's office, about the 3 pages she had laid on his desk, about the fact that he hadn't said no. I'm already telling them, she said, in my lane, the way I'm supposed to. He turned back to his rifle. She stood up, said good luck on the afternoon session, and walked away. She did not tell him it would be fine, because she didn't know that yet, and she had learned that false comfort was a kind of disrespect. On the 9th day, Dufresne made his move. It came during the indoor briefing session before the week's final qualification trial. Full cohort assembled, all assessors present, Griffith at the front of the room. Dufresne stood to the left of the projection screen with his arms loosely crossed, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment and had prepared for it. He had prepared a comparative data set, trial results from the past 3 years, presented side by side with results from equivalent programs in American and British special operations communities. The numbers were good. His numbers were very good. The pass rate, the performance scores, the retention in operational units post-qualification, all of it landed well in the room as it was designed to. Then he said, and I want to raise a procedural concern before we move to this week's trial. He looked at Griffith. There's a Meridian document in the system that appears to propose changes to our environmental assessment protocol. He said it carefully, clinically, with the precision of a man who knows how to use institutional language as a blade. I'd like clarification on whether that document represents an approved change or a recommendation still under review, because my assessors need to know what framework we're operating under this week. Every head in the room moved. Not dramatically. The small, efficient movement of people in tight institutional spaces who are tracking power dynamics in real time. Kehoe sat in the 3rd row. She had known something like this was coming since the equipment room conversation. She had spent the past 2 days preparing for it in the only way that mattered. By being right, completely and documentably right, about everything she had put in that folder. Griffith looked at her. She stood. The document is a recommendation under current review, she said. It hasn't been approved, and nothing in it affects the scoring criteria for this week's trial. She paused. What it proposes is an addition to the pre-brief protocol, not a change to the pass-fail threshold. Candidates would receive a disclosure that environmental degradation is assessed as a live variable in the trial. No change to what we're testing, a change to how honestly we're communicating the test design. The room was very quiet. Dufresne said, the current pre-brief protocol is sufficient. It's been producing qualified operators for 6 years. It has, she said. She kept her voice level. And this week we have a candidate, she did not use Arsenault's name, who failed a position because of a mirage effect he had no framework to identify, because no one in his preparation had discussed atmospheric layering at 400 meters in sub-zero temperatures. She looked at Dufresne. If he fails his final trial today, he leaves this cohort. If he passes, she looked at Griffith. We don't learn anything useful about whether our pre-brief is telling candidates what they actually need to know. Griffith said carefully. What are you suggesting, she said. Run the trial as scheduled, score it as written, and let me document what happens. A silence. Dufresne said nothing. He was very still in the particular way that experienced people are still when they have been handed a response they weren't entirely prepared for and need a moment to reassess. Griffith said, "Trial proceeds. Standard scoring. She may document." He looked at Dufresne. "Carry on." Dufresne turned back to the briefing. But Pellerin, sitting 2 seats to Kehoe's left, turned his head slightly and looked at her for a fraction of a second. It was not a warm look and not a cold one. It was the look of a man recalculating. What happened in the trial that morning was not dramatic in the way that range stories are sometimes told afterward as dramatic. It was quiet and precise, and it built from the first position to the last with the accumulating weight of something that had been prepared for thoroughly. Arsenault shot his 400-meter position clean. He had adjusted his pre-shot routine to include a vertical mirage check using a piece of thread he had taped to his scope hood, a simple field improvisation for detecting atmospheric layering that she had described to him in about 45 seconds on a bench in the prep area. It was not on any official checklist. It was just the kind of knowledge that passed from experienced hands to careful students when someone decided to actually transmit it. He also shot clean at 600. At 700, he had a partial wind shadow from a spruce line on the northwest approach, and she saw him check the lateral marker at range 4, the one she had pointed out to him the previous afternoon during a range walk she hadn't been asked to conduct but had done anyway. Because the information was there and withholding it from someone who needed it served no purpose she could identify. He adjusted. He shot. Clean. Vachon, standing at the scoring station, looked up from his clipboard with an expression she had come to recognize in people on this base. The expression of someone encountering an outcome they had not been expecting and were now quietly making room for in their understanding of how things worked. The 800-meter position was Arsenault's last. The conditions that morning were not kind. A crosswind had built through the session, variable, with a gust pattern that came in roughly 40-second cycles, which she had been tracking from the observation line. Standard procedure was to shoot in the first break between gusts. She had calculated that the cycle was drifting. Each pause was approximately 4 seconds shorter than the last, which meant the standard break would not be long enough by the time Arsenault reached his firing sequence. She had no formal way to communicate this to him. She was an observer. She had documentation authority and no more. She stood on the observation line and watched him settle into position and begin his pre-shot process. He had a small wind card he had made himself the way she had showed him 2 days before, with the cycle notation marked in 5-second increments. She saw him reference it before he set his final position. He waited through one cycle. The next cycle arrived early, by 3 seconds. He did not shoot in the standard break. He waited. She heard someone behind her shift their feet. Then the next pause opened. He shot. 800 meters. Clean. Dufresne was standing near the scoring station. He said nothing for a full 5 seconds. Then he said, in a voice that had lost some of the managed quality it usually carried, he logged the gust cycle. Pellerin said, "On a card." He made a card for it. There was a pause. Vachon said quietly, "Where did he learn to do that?" Nobody answered. But several people on the range looked toward the observation line, and Kehoe kept her eyes on the 800-meter target and wrote the time and the outcome in her field book and kept the expression on her face completely even, which cost her something and she knew it. The post-trial debrief was Dufresne's room to run, and he ran it well. He was thorough, professional, and gave appropriate credit to the cohort. He said nothing about Arsenault's performance specifically, which she noted. He said nothing about her documentation, which she also noted. He presented the week's results with the efficiency of a man who understood how to hold a room and had been doing it for a long time. She sat in the back and wrote her own record and did not look up when he spoke about the overall cohort strength. After the debrief, she was at her temporary desk in the small operations annex she'd been given, barely large enough for a chair and a table, but it had a door that closed. When there was a knock, Pellerin. He stood in the doorway with the same watchful neutrality he had carried for 8 days, the expression of a man who had been measuring something carefully and had recently reached a conclusion. "That card," he said, "the gust cycle card. That's not in any manual." "No," she said, "it's not. Where does it come from?" From doing it long enough that you start recognizing the patterns, she said, and from having someone show you what to look for. He looked at her for a long moment. He seemed to be working through something internal, the kind of arithmetic that doesn't involve numbers. Then he said, Dufresne taught me everything I know about reading wind. I've been using his system for 4 years. She waited. His system works, Pellerin said. It's worked every time I've needed it. He stopped, then started again with the careful phrasing of a man choosing his words with the same precision he applied to everything else. It didn't account for that. For the cycle drift, she said. He nodded once. For the cycle drift, he said. He stood there for another moment. Then he said something she had not expected. What does Meridian actually do, he said. The real version, not the briefing document version. She looked at him steadily. It documents what experienced marksmen know, she said. That hasn't been written down anywhere yet, and it finds a way to pass that knowledge to people who need it before they're in a position where not having it costs them something they can't get back. Pellerin was quiet. Then he said, How long have you been doing this? 11 years, she said. In the field for 7 of them. He nodded. Not a big nod. The small, decisive kind. He went back to the main room. She turned back to her documentation. On the 14th day, something she had not anticipated arrived in the form of a message from the CSOR Operational Planning Office. Not through Griffith. Not through Meridian's chain. Through Dufresne. He came to her door in the late afternoon with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not soft. Dufresne was not a man who softened easily, but something that had moved fractionally away from its usual set towards something she could only read as careful honesty. He sat down across from her. He did not say anything for a moment. Then, CSOR is planning an evaluation exercise. Real conditions, live variables, no range flags, no controlled environment. They want to observe the top candidates in operational context. He paused. They've asked for Meridian documentation to be incorporated into the assessment criteria. He said this with the flatness of a man who has been told something he didn't expect and has decided the only functional response is to deliver it accurately, which means your framework is being evaluated alongside mine in the same exercise. She kept her expression even. When? 3 weeks. She thought about the candidates, about Arsenal, about what 3 weeks could build or break depending on how the next days went. She thought about Dufresne and what it had cost him to walk into this room and tell her what he had just told her without editorializing, without the usual managed distance. That was not a small thing. What do you need from me? She said. He looked at her with the measuring expression he had been wearing since she arrived, the same one, but with something different in it now. A fractional opening. He needed 6 years of methodology and an 11-day read of his range to come to some kind of working agreement in 3 weeks, and they both understood that. A full map of your atmospheric data for ranges 3 to 5, he said. The calculations you've been running. I want to understand the model. She turned to her field book. She began from the beginning. He pulled his chair slightly forward. Outside, across the compound, the range flags moved in the late afternoon wind, which was shifting from the northwest, which she had already noted. They worked for 2 hours. He asked questions. Not the questions of someone fighting for ground, but the questions of a man who had spent his career caring about getting it right and had just discovered that there was more to get right than he had known. At some point, Pellerin appeared in the doorway without knocking, took a look at the two of them, bent over her field book, and quietly went away again. She did not mention it. Neither did Dufresne. When they finished, Dufresne sat back and looked at his own notes. Then he looked at her. Gagnon, he said. Day 1. First assessment session. He failed his 600 position, she remembered. Yes. Dufresne set his pen down. The flag gap on the north lane was intentional, he said. He said it the same way he said everything, directly, without decoration. But the intent was to observe adaptive response under degraded conditions, not to log a fail against someone who hit the wrong input, because the system didn't tell him the inputs were going to be degraded. She waited. He looked at the table. That's the difference you were talking about in Griffith's office. He said it as a statement, not a question. Yes, she said. That's the difference. He picked up his pen again. He looked at her without the managed measurement she had been reading in his face for 2 weeks and said with the particular flatness of a man who has decided to be honest rather than strategic, "I know this program. I built this program. And there are things in this field book," he didn't need to gesture at it, "that I should have known and didn't." She thought about what she was going to say. She chose the simplest true thing. "The people who stay learners in this work," she said, "are the ones who produce the best marksmen, not the ones who learn the fastest at the start, the ones who don't decide at some point that they already know enough." Dufresne looked at her steadily. He was not a man who softened, and nothing in him softened now, but something settled. The way a room settles when the pressure that has been building in it finds a place to go. He left. She sat alone in the annex with her field book and her notes and the thin autumn light coming through the single window. She thought about the exercise in 3 weeks and what it would ask of the candidates they'd spent the past 2 weeks teaching, and what it would ask of the methodology she'd been building since before some of those candidates were finished secondary school. She was not afraid of it. She understood it completely. Both were true. The message from Griffith came the next morning. Project Meridian Assessment Framework approved for integration into the CSOR Operational Evaluation Exercise. Joint Implementation Committee. Warrant Officer Dufresne and Corporal Kehoe, co-leads. Documentation phase to follow. She read the message, standing in the doorway of the annex with her coffee. She read it once. She put her phone in her jacket pocket and picked up her field book. Arsenault was at the range when she got there, running a pre-dawn position drill he had set up himself, timing his own cycle observations, noting the variables in a small notebook he held in his non-shooting hand. He hadn't been asked to do this. He was there because the range was open, and the light was coming and the work was available to him, and he had decided he wanted to know. She stood at the edge of the range and watched him for a moment without announcing herself. He was working the 800-meter position. She could see him referencing his wind card and then looking up not at the flag, at the tree line at the far edge of the impact area where the branches moved in a way that the flags did not show. He was reading the range, truly reading it, not performing a checklist. Seeing. She made a note in her field book, Arsenault, Day 15, Independent Variable Recognition, Tree Line Wind Indicator, unprompted. And she wrote the time. She thought about the conversation she would have with Dufresne that morning, about the exercise parameters and the integration plan and the specific documentation that would take weeks to compile correctly. She thought about Pellerin and the fact that he had started quietly, keeping a wind log of his own. She thought about Gagnon, whose file she had flagged in the Meridian documentation as a candidate who had been failed by the test design before he had the chance to be assessed by it, and who deserved a better look. The work ahead of her was not small. It would require patience and precision, and the willingness to keep building something that most people around her were still deciding whether to believe in. She knew this. She had no illusions about the timeline. She also knew what she'd seen in 2 weeks on a range in Petawawa. A young candidate logging a gust cycle on a handmade card at 800 meters because someone had taken 45 seconds to tell him that the information was real and worth keeping. A warrant officer pulling his chair forward at the end of a long day to understand a model he hadn't known existed. A range safety officer beginning quietly, without being asked, to take his own notes about the wind. The knowledge didn't stay where you put it. When it was real and you gave it to someone who was ready for it, it moved. That was what she had come here to do. Not to win an argument, not to prove that the old way was wrong, to hand the knowledge to the next set of hands and trust that they would carry it further than she could carry it alone. She walked out to the range. Arsenault heard her and looked up. She nodded toward the 800-meter target. "Show me your cycle notation," she said. He handed her the card. She read it. She handed it back. He'd gotten the principle right. The intervals were slightly off for the morning's specific conditions, which were cooler than the previous week by about 4 degrees, which changed the thermal layer, which changed everything downstream. She told him exactly that, in the same way she always told people things, directly, completely, without making it about anything other than the information itself. He listened. He corrected his card. He resettled into position. He waited for the cycle. He shot. 800 meters. She saw the trace. She watched the impact marker. She wrote the time in her field book. Then she turned north, into the wind that was already shifting again, the way it always shifted at this hour, and she started building the picture of the day.